Reading the Times for Saturday, March 7th, 2020. Spiraling virus fears are causing financial carnage. More often, market turmoil comes from within. The mortgage crises and collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008, tremors in the junk bond market in 1987 and 1989, and the demise of the giant long-term capital management hedge fund in 1998. In 2001, no one knew if the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were merely the first in a series of strikes. One reason investors feared that the Fed, whose monetary policy has been key to the stock market's long rally, is running out of options to stimulate the economy. The reality is that nobody knows quite how to calm markets, much less how to contain the virus outbreak. The only choice is to wait for death. There's been no let-up for the people of Idlib province as the forces of President Bashar al-Assad of Syria, backed by Russian air power, have smashed their way forward, demolishing towns and villages in the south and east of the province with punishing airstrikes. Billboards around the city bear glossy posters of uniformed rebel fighters calling on people to join the fight. His teams were still helping people flee villages on the front line and preparing in case of a mass evacuation of the city. Trump names Mark Meadows chief of staff, ousting Mick Mulvaney. President Trump on Friday pushed out Mick Mulvaney, his acting White House chief of staff, and replaced him with Representative Mark Meadows, a stalwart conservative ally, shaking up his team in middle of one of the biggest crises of his presidency. Fiona Hill, a former White House aide, told House investigators last fall that Mr. Mulvaney had been involved in arranging a White House visit for President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine that was tied to whether he would conduct investigations sought by Mr. Trump and his personal lawyer, Rudolph W. Giuliani. Unlike his predecessor, John F. Kelly, a retired Marine general who left in late 2018, Mr. Mulvaney made a point of not trying to control the famously mercurial president and instead let Trump be Trump. Saudi prince detains senior members of royal family. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia has detained one of the most senior members of the royal family, a former crown prince and a royal cousin, for unexplained reasons. A relative and a person close to the royal family said Friday. The senior royal, Prince Ahmed bin Abdulaziz, is a younger brother of King Salman and an uncle to the crown prince. The former crown prince who was arrested, Mohammed bin Nayef, is also the former interior minister and a longtime favorite in Washington. The Bernie Sanders personality test. Mr. Sanders never makes you feel like you're good enough to be in the room with him, one former aide said. Mr. Sanders never had any intention of sidelining his close friends, and Mr. Weaver remains as influential as ever, according to campaign aides. Randy Bryce, a Sanders campaign surrogate from Wisconsin, remembered going on a campaign swing with Mr. Sanders in New Hampshire that last year. With test kits in short supply, health officials sound alarms. President Trump claimed again on Friday that anyone who needed a coronavirus test gets a test. But from Washington State to Florida to New York, doctors and patients are clamoring for tests that they say are woefully short supply, and their frustration is mounting alongside the growing number of cases around the country. In the last week, Mr. Trump and his top officials repeatedly promised that 1 million to 1.5 million tests would be sent around the country, even though labs, government, and private ones alike have struggled to get the tests running amid a growing number of infections and rising demand for tests. Azar told reporters, I just want to make it clear that in terms of tests, we have provided all tests to the state of Washington and the state of California that they've asked for. The production and shipping of tests that we've talked about all week is completely on schedule. Like licking an ashtray fires invisible threat to Australia's wines. Down the road at Brokenwood Wines, where Mr. Riggs is a chief winemaker, the smell of crushed grapes and fermented alcohol seeps from empty crates and tanks that are normally bursting with fruit that produces the vineyard's Shiraz, Chardonnay, and Semillon blends. The irony, winemakers note, is that the grapes have been harvested and stored in a warehouse that burned down in the fires. They would have been insured for that and compensated. The industry has also started campaigns urging Australians to visit their local wineries, buy Australian wine, or plan to return to wine regions for their next vacation. Gunman kills dozens at event attended by Afghan politicians. Afghanistan's capital erupted into violence on Friday when a sustained gun battle broke out at an event attended by the opposition leader Abdullah, officials said. The Taliban, who had recently resumed attacks against government forces after signing a peace deal with the United States, denied involvement in the attack. Mr. Ghani called the attack a crime against humanity and against the national unity of Afghanistan, and said he had spoken to Mr. Abdullah on the phone. After tours in Afghanistan, U.S. veterans weigh peace with the Taliban. And as officials prepare to implement the terms of a deal, American veterans who served in the country are left to grapple with the provisions that may result in more uncertainty than stability for the people of Afghanistan they once fought to protect. A third of IAVA's veteran members deployed to Afghanistan were at least once, according to Butler, and some have 5 or more combat deployments there. Last year, Concerned Veterans for America, a conservative advocacy group, made ending the post-September 11th wars a legislative priority, a policy agenda it shared with more progressive veteran groups on the left, like Vote Vets and Common Defense. Suicide bombers attack near U.S. Embassy in Tunisia. Emergency personnel are responding to an explosion that occurred near the U.S. Embassy in Tunis, the embassy's account posted on Twitter. U.S. embassies in Tunis, March 6, 2020. The Tunisian media reported that a man had approached a police checkpoint near the embassy on a motorcycle and detonated explosives shortly before noon, local time. The attacker appeared to have targeted a police car, which was parked near the embassy and was damaged in the explosion, according to France 24. Pictures and videos shared on social media showed debris on the road near the embassy and human remains believed to be from the attacker. The woman who's shaking up Britain's Labour leadership campaign, with analysis pointing to the Labour's betrayal of his working-class roots in England's industrial north and a slide toward London-centred left-wing politics under Mr. Corbyn as a reason for its steep losses. Miss Nandy offers an alternative, albeit most likely for the future. In a straw poll of the audience after the most recent Sky News debate between the 3 candidates, Miss Nandy was the clear crowd favorite. Mr. Nandy went on to become the first director of the Runnymede Trust think tank on race and helped draft Britain's Race Relations Bill of 1976. Miss Nandy's pedigree also included her maternal grandfather, Frank Byers, who was a Liberal member of Parliament and went on to lead his party in the House of Lords. Truck crashes into an Easter Island statue. Ma Henua, the island's cultural heritage organization, posted photographs of the crash on its Facebook page, showing the vehicle perched on top of an intact statue that had been on its side near the Ahu, where it once stood. The Easter Island statues are sacred to the people of the island, which they call Rapa Nui. Some of the statues are full figures, buried neck-deep in trenches, hillsides, or quarries. Joanne Van Tilburg, an archaeologist and director of the Easter Island Statue Project, said there are about 350 Ahu structures throughout the island, each having 1 to 15 statues on it. Crisis deepens in tiny Guyana, the world's newest petrostate. The electoral authorities in Guyana, the world's newest oil producer, pushed it deeper into political crises Friday by announcing the government had won the most votes in the March 2 elections, overriding objections from judges, international observers, and the opposition. Supporters of Guyana's main opposition party blocked roads, burned tires, and clashed with the police across the countryside. Guyana's main private sector association, which formed part of the observer mission, went further, accusing the head of Guyana's Electoral Commission of allowing attempts to perpetuate election fraud. The coronavirus, by the numbers. The problem with just dividing the total number of deaths and total number of cases is that it doesn't account for unreported cases or the delay from illness to death. Plus, some cases might be missed. If you have 2 deaths from 2 cases, as happened in Iran last month, the most likely means you've missed a bunch of cases. Early on, people looked at total current cases and deaths, which I said is flawed calculation, and concluded that the case fatality rate must be 2% based on China data. How to quarantine yourself. Washington State's website said the health department can help with groceries for those unable to leave their home and even intervene with employers on their behalf if necessary. People with health insurance, inadequate insurance, or no regular doctor would be reluctant to seek care if they have symptoms, fearing steep medical bills, he noted. Providing for people who make sacrifices for the greater good is crucial, said Lawrence Gostin, a law professor at Georgetown University and director of the World Health Organization Collaborating Center for National and Global Health Law. We ought to have a social compact. If you're sick, whether you've got COVID-19 or not, you should separate yourself from society, Mr. Gostin said. As death toll mounts, governments point fingers over coronavirus. The sharpest reaction came from its regional adversary, Saudi Arabia, which forbids its people from traveling to Iran. In a statement made through the official Saudi press agency, the government on Thursday accused Iran of recklessly allowing the disease to spread. It said that 5 Saudis had visited Iran, helped by Iranian officials who did not stamp their passports, and had returned to the kingdom infested by the virus. Dr. Fukuda, who now heads the University of Hong Kong School of Public Health, said the widespread anger in Hong Kong at the government's refusal to bar arrivals from mainland China built on months of professional protest against the government being too close to Beijing. The virus has especially roiled Iran's government, with dozens of officials having fallen ill, and an advisor to the supreme leader and a diplomat having died. China pushes back as coronavirus crisis damages its image. The epidemic is a lost opportunity for China to rebuild some goodwill with Americans and other countries. Susan L. Shirk, chairwoman of the 21st Century China Center at the University of California, San Diego, wrote in an email. In the case of the Wall Street Journal, China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs went further, expelling 3 journalists from the newspaper's Beijing bureau over a headline on an opinion piece page essay, "China is the real sick man of Asia." Rush Doshi, the director of the China Strategy Initiative at the Brookings Institute in Washington, said that China's effort to rewrite the narrative by donating test kits and sending other aid could pay off. Coronavirus in NYC, why closing public schools is a last resort. There are no plans to shut schools down, and Mayor Bill de Blasio said on Friday that none of the city's 1.1 million public school students had shown any symptoms of the virus. The situation had been so starkly different thus far at some of the city's elite private schools, where the student bodies tend to be much whiter and wealthier than they are in public schools. Younger students had also been coming to school confused and sometimes fearful, said Deirdre Levy, a third-grade special education teacher at Public School 9 in Brooklyn. South by Southwest is canceled as coronavirus fears scuttle festival. The 34th annual edition of the South by Southwest, the sprawling festival of music, technology, and film in Austin, Texas, has become a highlight on the annual global cultural calendar. Was canceled by city officials on Friday over fears about the rapid spread of coronavirus. Last year, South by Southwest various events had a combined attendance of 417,000, including 159,000 who came to the music portion, according to festival figures. Originally a scrappy showcase for new bands, South by Southwest, or South by as it's widely known, has long since morphed into a vast mix of media, marketing, and pop culture, where major brands intermingle with tech startups and independent musicians to mutually drum up buzz. First, U.S. colleges close classroom as virus spreads. More could follow. The University of Washington said on Friday it would cancel in-person classes and have students take courses and finals remotely, while the Seattle area grapples with growing coronavirus outbreak, and a move that other colleges across the country are preparing to follow if the virus becomes more widespread. Well, I'm getting the virus myself, shit. Over the last few days, a growing number of universities have mobilized emergency planning teams to envision what a shutdown would look like, especially if students bring the virus back with them from spring break, which starts Friday on many campuses. Already, some students have been warned that they should be prepared to learn online, as many students studying abroad in Europe and Asia have been forced to do. The note said the school was bracing for the possibility that on-campus classes would have to end if a student or teacher got infected, and students could be forced to finish the semester remotely. 21 coronavirus cases on cruise ship near California. As of Friday afternoon, California had more than 70 confirmed cases, not counting the cases of the ship. More cases with links to the ship emerged on Friday. In Placer County, northeast of San Francisco, officials announced 3 new cases, all passengers who had previously traveled on the Grand Princess on a trip to Mexico. Tests from the cruise ship have been eagerly awaited since the governor's announcement earlier this week that 11 passengers and 10 crew members on the ship had been showing flu-like symptoms. Trump says people have to remain calm amid coronavirus outbreak. President Trump sought to play down the coronavirus outbreak on Friday, offered a vote of confidence to besieged federal health officials as infections spread further. Markets tumbled again, and authorities scrambled to accelerate the availability of test kits across the country. Mr. Trump rejected any suggestion that the CDC had not acted aggressively enough, presenting officials to reporters to describe how they quickly moved to develop a diagnostic test when China reported its own outbreak. Mr. Trump lashed out at Governor Jay Inslee of Washington, a former Democratic presidential candidate who has criticized the president's leadership on the coronavirus, and met on Thursday with Mr. Pence. Top coronavirus official for U.S. has fought an epidemic before. There are lots of things that can go wrong here, said Dr. Thomas Frieden, who worked with Dr. Birx when he ran the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and she oversaw the CDC's Division on Global AIDS. It's possibly that we look back in 6 months and say, it's not so bad, we overreacted. We just don't know, but we wouldn't want to look back in 6 months and say we underreacted. Unlike Dr. Anthony S. Fauci, another member of the coronavirus task force and the oft-quoted director of the National Institute on Allergy and Infectious Diseases, Dr. Birx, who carried the rank of ambassador at the State Department, is stepping gingerly into the public eye. Dr. Birx faces multiple challenges, Dr. Frieden said. Immigration officers say asylum deal with Guatemala is unlawful. A union representing federal asylum officers said on Friday that a Trump administration policy that diverts migrants at the southwestern border to Guatemala unlawfully sends a vulnerable population to a country in which their lives and freedom are directly threatened under the asylum deal, initially described as a safe third country agreement. The administration can deport migrants at the southwestern border seeking safety in the United States to Guatemala to seek refuge there, referring to the Central American countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. The filing noted, rather than have their asylum claims heard, refugees from the Northern Triangle countries are permanently removed to other Northern Triangle countries, which are themselves some of the most dangerous countries on earth and are the source of the large number of refugees. Judge orders deportation of Tennessee man who served as Nazi camp guard. The Justice Department said the man, Frederick Karl Berger, 94, was an armed guard at a sump camp of the Nungam concentration camps, where prisoners were held during the winter of 1945 and forced to work outdoors to the point of exhaustion and death. A federal immigration judge in Memphis, Rebecca L. Holt, found that Mr. Berger was deportable under the 1978 Holtzman Amendment to the Immigration and Nationality Act because his willing service as an armed guard of prisoners at concentration camps where persecution took place constituted assistance in Nazi-sponsored persecution, the department said. At the end of March 1945, when the Nazis abandoned Meppen to escape advancing British and Canadian forces, Mr. Berger helped guard prisoners during their forcible evacuation to the main camp, a nearly 2-week trek under inhuman conditions that claimed the lives of some 70 prisoners, the department said. Military to be sent to border before Supreme Court's Remain in Mexico ruling. The Trump administration will deploy 160 troops to 2 ports of entry along the southwestern border before a Supreme Court decision that officials fear could prompt large crowds of migrants to seek entry into the United States. More than 5,000 active duty troops and members of the National Guard are already stationed at the border to secure ports of entry, hold training sessions, provide support at holding facilities, and help with border wall construction. An internal document from the Department of Homeland Security concluded in November 2018 that the probability of American border officials facing violence at the southwestern border was minimal. Joe Biden has had flimsy organization. It hasn't hurt him. Mr. Biden's surrogates have sprung into action seeking to help him acquire additional support in upcoming key states through methods both traditional, Miss Klobuchar deployed to Michigan for Mr. Biden, and creative. The former U.S. ambassador to Ireland was listed as hosting an organization event recently for Mr. Biden in the small city of Bolivar, Missouri. According to his campaign, Mr. Biden has more than 70 endorsements in Missouri, more than 50 in Florida, and around 20 in Michigan. In Michigan, Mayor Mike Dugan of Detroit, another Biden supporter, said the Biden campaign was relying on volunteers and had long made clear that it did not intend to establish a large presence of paid staff in the state. I'm sorry, what? Senator Chris Coons, a Democrat of Delaware and a strong Biden supporter, said when asked about the ad, Senator Sanders seriously considered primarying Barack Obama in 2012 and routinely criticized him and his proposals. So if this is a race between former Vice President Biden and Senator Sanders as to who has the experience and vision that moves forward the Obama-Biden agenda, it's undeniably Joe Biden. Mr. Sanders has denied that he considered challenging Mr. Obama. Sanders continues attack on trade but concedes Biden could beat Trump. In Michigan, where the Sanders campaign is running a TV ad featuring an auto worker who says his community has been decimated by free trade deals, Mr. Sanders attacked Mr. Biden for his support of the North American Free Trade Agreement in the 1990s, in a sign of the careful approach both candidates are taking while seeking to draw distinctions between their campaigns. Mr. Sanders reiterated multiple times he would support Mr. Biden if he eventually won the presidential nomination, and pressed by a reporter, said he believed Mr. Biden could beat Mr. Trump in November. Mr. Sanders has watched his delegate lead evaporate after its first 3 nominating contests as Mr. Biden racked up wins in South Kakalaka and several Super Tuesday states, including some that Mr. Sanders had hoped would wind up in his column. South Bend officer will not be charged in shooting death of black resident. The shooting on June 16th of a black man by a white police sergeant led to a crisis for Mr. Buttigieg's campaign and highlighted policing problems in the city. Richard J. Hurtle, a special prosecutor who was appointed in July to investigate the shooting, said Friday that Sergeant O'Neill was justified in his actions because Mr. Logan, 54, whom the authorities had said was holding a knife, had posed an imminent danger. Sergeant O'Neill won't be charged in the shooting, but the prosecutor on Friday charged him with public indecency and misconduct for soliciting a prostitute a month before the episode. Bernie Sanders might have a Michigan problem. Whatever the case, Mr. Sanders has often made up for the losses in white working-class areas this year, with gains among Latino voters and white voters who live in left liberal areas. Yes, there are Washington and Idaho, two states with liberal Democratic voters, similar to those in California, Utah, and Colorado, where Mr. Sanders won on Super Tuesday. Missouri poses a Michigan-like challenge for Mr. Sanders, but here the more creative white voters would seem to offer even fewer opportunities for Mr. Sanders. Which Democrats are leading the 2020 presidential race? Candidates in the chart without donation numbers joined the race after the financial disclosure reporting deadline. The candidate's ability to make news and draw the attention of voters and cameras is a major asset in any campaign. Mentions are the number of 15-second clips in which a candidate's full name is mentioned on any of the 3 cable networks. Why supporters aren't a lock to get behind Sanders. There's a reason to believe that former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. could pick up nearly as many of Ms. Warren's former voters as Mr. Sanders does. In a Quinnipiac poll conducted earlier last month, when Mr. Biden was reeling from a weak performance in the Iowa caucuses, Ms. voters were 4 times as likely to name Mr. Sanders as a second choice as they were to pick Mr. Biden. The good news for Mr. Sanders is that Ms. backers are highly likely to identify as liberals, even more so than his own. An exit poll suggests that the 2 candidates' voters tended to agree on the issues. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi, no problem. Growing up inside America's quiet zone. People come to our gym to play and they walk around with their phones looking for Wi-Fi and we're like, there's none of that, so live like the rest of us. Charity Warder 18. Welcome to Green Bay, population 143, where Wi-Fi is both unavailable and banned and where cell phone signals are non-existent. Her school cyberbullying seminars have felt irrelevant until an out-of-town basketball game during her freshman year, where a girl posted a video of Charity joking around in the bathroom. Charity's mother, Tanya Warder, has warned her daughter about the risk of technology and has wondered how she will fare in college with widely available cell phone coverage and Wi-Fi. Communication is a dying art because kids don't talk, Miss Warder said, adding that she appreciates how the lack of cell phone service has influenced the habits of youth in and around Greenbank. Barr increasingly appears focused on undermining Mueller inquiry. I'm deeply troubled by what I've seen with Barr's stewardship of the Justice Department, said Nancy V. Baker, a scholar of attorneys general who studied Mr. Barr's first stint in the post under President George Bush in the early 1990s. Last month, Mr. Barr appointed another outside prosecutor to review a case that Mr. Mueller brought against the president's former national security advisor, Michael T. Flynn, for lying to the FBI, and in a second case that Mr. Mueller's team brought against Roger J. Stone, Jr., Mr. Trump's longtime friend. The Attorney General overruled career prosecutors to seek a much more lenient prison sentence, triggering a chain of events that federal judge overseeing the case called unprecedented. Representative Devin Nunes, Republican of California and another staunch defender of the president, has promised to ask the Justice Department to open a criminal inquiry into whether the special counsel's office mishandled the prosecution of George Papadopoulos, a former Trump campaign advisor, who pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI. Both Mr. Barr's critics and defenders are carefully watching the Flynn case for signs that Mr. Barr is backing away from what had been an aggressive prosecution initiated by Mr. Mueller and inherited by the United States Attorney's Office in Washington. Bill Clinton explains Monica Lewinsky's affair as managing my anxieties. The four-part docuseries Hillary, which was released on Friday on Hulu, focuses on Hillary Clinton's life, her marriage to Mr. Clinton, and her unsuccessful campaign for president in 2016. In the series, Mr. Clinton, 73, is asked by the director, Nanette Bernstein, why he engaged in an affair with Miss Lewinsky, then a White House intern, and whether he weighed the risks. Mr. Clinton at first denied having sexual relations with Miss Lewinsky during a videotaped deposition in a sexual harassment lawsuit brought against him by Paula Corbett Jones, a former Arkansas state employee who claimed that Mr. Clinton had exposed himself to her and propositioned her at a hotel room in 1991 when he was governor. In the documentary, which features behind-the-scenes footage from Mrs. Clinton's campaign against Mr. Trump and was screened at the Sundance Film Festival in January, Mrs. Clinton says that Mr. Clinton sat on the side of the bed one morning and said a newspaper was set to publish allegations that he had sexual relations with an intern. Democratic majority in Virginia strips itself of the power to draw distinct lines. Many Democrats had made campaign promises to support the amendment on its second vote, and they were under intense pressure to make good on that pledge. The Virginia debate unfolded as Republicans in three other states have moved to roll back ballot initiatives favoring nonpartisan redistricting that voters approved in 2018. In Missouri, where 60% of voters backed a constitutional amendment mandating nonpartisan maps, the Republican-controlled legislature is pushing a new amendment initiative that would effectively repeal the overhaul. One thing we've seen is that voters are legitimately angry at the idea of politicians trying to overturn their vote. When coronavirus quarantine is class warfare. Recently, BuzzFeed News reported that tech companies are looking at the outbreak as a test case for the long gestating but never arriving moment when workers working remotely will broadly replace working in person. Working from home is a privilege afforded almost exclusively to knowledge workers. More flexible work could take the burden of some families with regard to childcare and make part-time careers or balancing work and family life easier. If Joe Biden wins. If Biden wins only the nominations, I won't have to worry that there's a fair chance in Bernie Sanders. A man could be elected president who, without nuance or discrimination, demonizes entire sectors of American industry. If Biden wins, I won't have to read that the president has told fellow American lawmakers to go back to the countries of birth or ancestry. If Biden wins, I won't have to listen to the president call members of my profession the enemy of the American people, or people from my political viewpoint human scum, or colleagues stone cold losers. I won't have to spend time wondering whether being an unindicted co-conspirator in a hush money scandal rises to the level of an impeachable offense. In Mexico, a woman breaks silence against femicide. Yesenia's anger, so public and digital, is the expression of a new culture against silence and machismo taking root in Mexico, a culture in which women are demanding equal treatment. To classify a crime as a femicide, Mexico's federal criminal code requires that victim displays signs of sexual violence, or the existence of previous threats, evidence of harassment, a history of violent episodes, a romantic relationship, the deprivation of the victim's freedoms, or the forced exposures of a person's body in a public place. At the end of January, 40,299 Mexicans have been killed since Mexico's president Andrés Manuel López Obrador, also known as AMLO, took office on December 1st, 2018. Our pursuit of happiness is killing the planet. Constant wasn't thinking of Marie Antoinette's right to play at shepherdess when her subjects starved, but the right to open a shop and build yourself a home rather than be drafted into Napoleon's army, spreading republicanism across the face of Europe. What do we do once we see some of those choices threaten the health and lives of others? We will have to strike a new equilibrium between what society has the right to demand of us and what we have a right to retain for ourselves. A liberal, as he once put it, was prepared to use government to ensure ordinary citizens the right to own economic and political life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Where's Joe Biden's universal child care plan? The toxicity of his words infected the debate over child care for decades and helped bury the history of public child care in America. A 2006 survey found that fewer than 10% of American daycare centers provided high-quality care. The article argued against any universal government child care assistance because it would go to well-to-do families, but also it repeated language from Republicans who fear-mongered about child care. Biden versus Sanders, the next leg of the Democratic race. Here's how. Bernie must call up Joe Biden now and tell him that if he will publicly and enthusiastically endorse a Green New Deal, Bernie will quit the race and work to unite the party. Mr. Bloomberg entered when Joe Biden seemed to be faltering, and no viable moderate alternative was available. As soon as the facts changed, he bowed out, vowing to put his resources behind Mr. Biden and many down-ticket Democrats. Defending Bernie Sanders' sister city efforts in the USSR. Papers detail Soviet hopes for Sanders as a distortion of history. Expanding people-to-people ties was one of the most important goals of President Ronald Reagan's policy toward the USSR, a policy that was continued by President George H.W. Bush. The explanation the Soviets gave to local communist officials in Yaroslavl that sister city relationships are useful for carrying out information propaganda efforts was actually an effort to justify Mikhail Gorbachev's new openness to people who had no contact with Americans and were trained to see all Americans as spies. In 1985, 3 years before Mayor Bernie Sanders of Burlington, Vermont, visited the Soviet Union to set up a sister city link, the Times reported that President Ronald Reagan was urging bold new steps to open the way for our peoples to participate in an unprecedented way in the building of peace. Sister cities were among the initiatives he promoted. The original Long Islanders fight to save their land from a rising sea. Rising seas are threatening to eat away at the Shinnecock Islands. The tribe is using everything at its disposal to calm the waves and restore a long, slim beach at the edge of Shinnecock Bay. Dredged sands, sea grasses, beach grasses, boulders, oyster shells. On the Shinnecock's beach, facing Shinnecock Bay and the barrier island out in front, the sands have shifted over the years, as sands naturally do. A deaf, blind dishwasher achieves his childhood dream, movie actor. Robert Tarango, 55, is perhaps the first deaf-blind actor in a lead movie role. The work Robert Tarango, 55, is perhaps the first deaf-blind actor in the worker Robert Tarango, 55, is perhaps the first deaf-blind actor in a lead movie role. Relying on translators while shooting the film in New York City a year ago, Mr. Tarango developed a bond with his co-star Stephen Prescott, who plays Tariq, the troubled teen who helps Mr. Tarango's deaf-blind character, Artie, to the bus stop. As Weinstein awaits prison, prosecutors detail 40 years of accusations. The filing said in the 1990s that in the 1990s, a 19-year-old employee of Mr. Weinstein's said he had sexually assaulted her in a hotel room during a business meeting, that a second 19-year-old woman had accused him of asking her to remove her top as he lay naked on a hotel room bed, and that a third woman had said he had forcibly kissed her on an elevator in New York City after interviewing her for an internship at his company. One executive told prosecutors that Mr. Weinstein had instructed him to lie for him about his abuse of women after the New Yorker published an expose about the producer in 2017. Other former employees who were quoted in the memo described Mr. Weinstein as a bully with a volcanic temper who berated people and had physically assaulted workers and business partners, including his brother, Bob Weinstein. One longtime executive at the Weinstein's company, Miramax, said that Harvey Weinstein had zero compassion, empathy, civility, the memo said. A global outbreak is fueling the backlash to globalization. As the coronavirus spreads around the world, companies are seeking alternatives to making goods in China, while right-wing political parties fulminate against open borders. Last week, Mr. Trump's senior trade advisor, Peter Navarro, who wrote a book called Death by China, used the coronavirus as a stark reminder that the United States has allowed too much factory production to leave its shores. Hyundai, the world's fifth largest automaker, halted production at its factories in South Korea last month because of a shortage of parts made in China. Can you really hire a hitman on the dark web? Unlike most sites on the traditional internet, dark web sites use technology that allows both sides of an online interaction to hide their identity and location from each other and law enforcement. One site, which provides readers with a link to a darknet address of the 18th Street Gang, holds itself out as a guide to real hitmen, facts, and stories. The site claims that people who say hitman sites are scams are just trying to discourage people from seeking them out. Mr. Monteiro hacked into one of the sites created by the most notorious purveyor of assassination sites, a figure going by the name Yura. After breaking into the Bessa Mafia site and a few others, Mr. Monteiro found information about 283 people who had paid for hitman services. The market is rocky. Will target date funds change their strategy? The growth of these funds is staggering. The amount of workplace retirement plan money, in target date funds just passed $1 trillion, accounting for 21% of the total, according to an analysis from Brightscope and the Investment Company Institute. Jake Gilliam, head client portfolio strategist for the group that includes target date funds, is old enough to remember 2006 when the stock market was a rocket ship and people were telling him that his funds did not take enough risk. Many function as mutual funds containing other mutual funds, which can mean layers of fees. Florida lobster got a break on China tariffs. Then came the coronavirus. The effect of the coronavirus has been a shakeup across the entire lobster supply chain in the U.S. and Canada, said Annie Salikis, executive director of the Lobster Dealers Association in Maine, where 4 out of 5 American lobsters are caught. Over the past decade, China's demand for live lobster, a sign of wealth and status among the country's rapidly growing middle class, has transformed Florida's lobster industry. About 10 years ago, he switched to selling live lobsters directly to Chinese buyers who waited on the docks in Key Largo for his boat and then picked through the lobsters as they were unloaded. Stocks and bond yields sink, capping a week of wild trading. Traders push stocks in many Asia's biggest financial capitals, down by more than 2% on fears that the spread of coronavirus outside of China would dent global growth. In Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Seoul, markets closed this week, down more than 2%. In the mainland Chinese markets of Shanghai and Shenzhen, markets fell about 1%. U.S. added 273,000 jobs in February before coronavirus spread widely. A clearer picture of the impact on the labor market from disrupted supply chains or changes in travel, entertainment, and dining plans should emerge over the next couple of months. Where it's likely to affect the labor market is the reduced hours for service workers, said Diane Lim, an economist at the Penn Wharton Budget Model. The labor market has been remarkably resilient, delivering job gains for 112 months in a row, despite global slowdowns, bitter trade fights, and stock market gyrations. Why a coronavirus recession could be extra painful. Its suddenness. Often, when the economy runs into trouble, it goes through a slow glide from good times to bad. Other times, it's more like a fast car slamming on the brakes. In the last two such episodes, there were a prolonged period when imbalances in economy were correcting themselves before economic pain really started to bite. The question for the economy in 2020 and beyond is whether coronavirus economic impact can really be walled off from the rest of the economy and financial system, resulting in a painful but short interlude. Trump administration blocks Chinese acquisition of hotel software company. The Trump administration ordered a Chinese company on Friday to separate itself from an American maker of cloud-based hotel management software over national security concerns, the latest example of the more stringent approach American officials have taken to policing Chinese investment in the United States. In a statement Friday, the Trump administration said there was credible evidence that the Beijing Shiji Information Technology and its Hong Kong subsidiary might take action that threatens to impair the national security of the United States. It ordered the Chinese company to divest itself of Stay in Touch, an American company that makes cloud-based hotel management software and its assets, including customer data, within 120 days. The Trump administration has taken a more critical view of Chinese companies acquiring American companies that collect various kinds of data on American citizens, including their social media activity, health information, and financial transactions. Oil prices nosedive as OPEC and Russia fail to reach a deal. The messy ending of the meeting at OPEC's headquarters in Vienna risks sending oil prices into a freefall, said Bjarne Tonghaugen, head of oil market research at Rystad Energy, a market research firm. Consumers are likely to benefit from lower prices for gasoline and other oil products, but shale oil producers in the United States may slow investment in drilling and lay off workers. While the standoff between the two oil powers continued, oil swelled, threatening a lasting glut, analysts said. Boeing faces $20 million fine by the FAA. The agency accused Boeing of installing the systems in 618 Boeing 737NGs and 173 MAX planes. The FAA proposed a $5.4 million fine in January after it accused Boeing of installing substandard components in the MAX and other aircraft. The majority staff accused Boeing of overlooking safety in the interest of meeting production goals, making misguided assumptions about flight control software known as MCAS, and hiding information from the FAA, the public, and Boeing customers, along with other things. Bond hits historic lows, prompting Fed to ponder, what more can we do? The Federal Reserve may need to buy assets other than government bonds to counter the next downturn, a Fed official said Friday, a dramatic suggestion meant to bolster the central bank's increasingly depleted toolkit for fighting a downturn. Slumping long-term interest rates leave the Fed with dangerously little room to stimulate the economy should things worsen. Mr. Rosengren said that if the Fed cuts its policy interest rates to near zero, it is possible that the 10-year Treasury rate would follow. How not to become a victim of Social Security fraud. The criminals can be so convincing that some people fall victim to the schemes and end up losing money, often by buying gift cards and revealing their PINs. It's not clear where the volume of calls is increased, but the government is getting thousands of complaints about them. Gail Ennis, the Social Security Administration's Inspector General, said in a call with reporters this week, Congress last year passed the Trace Act, which requires telecommunication companies to adopt technology to identify spoofed calls that criminals make using phone numbers that mimic legitimate calls on your phone. Criminals email official-looking documents purported to be Social Security papers. More recently, they've started sending text messages that appear to be coming from the agency, urging people to call the number to resolve a legal problem, a Social Security number. Why the coronavirus could threaten the U.S. economy even more than China's. China's authoritarian government can quarantine entire cities or order people off the streets in a way that would be hard to imagine in America, presumably giving China an advantage in slowing the spread of the disease. 41% of China's population lives outside urban areas, more than twice the share in the United States. On the flip side, agriculture, a sector not noted for day-to-day social interaction and so potentially less harmed by social withdrawal, is a 10-time larger share of China's economy than it is in the United States. Close call. NASA Boeing investigation of Starliner flight finds lapses. An uncrewed test flight of Starliner, a Boeing spacecraft designed to carry NASA astronauts, could have ended in disaster in December because of lapses that allowed software errors to slip through undetected and unfixed before the spacecraft launched, according to a review by NASA and Boeing that was announced on Friday. Kathy Luders, program manager for NASA's Commercial Crew Program, said NASA had already sent more software experts to keep a closer eye on Boeing. NASA is planning to use a commercial approach for a lander to take NASA astronauts back to the moon, similar to the one used for the Boeing and SpaceX program, where the companies and not NASA own the systems, and the companies have also more freedom in coming up with a design which reduces the cost. There are 2 seats left for this trip to the International Space Station. On Thursday, Axiom Space, a company run by former manager of NASA's part of the space station, announced that it had signed a contract with SpaceX, Elon Musk's rocket company, which for what might be the first fully private human spaceflight to orbit. The space adventure trip, which could happen in late 2021 or early 2022, would follow an elliptical path, taking the capsule and its passengers 2 to 3 times as high as the space station's orbit. Last year, the United Arab Emirates bought a Soyuz seat to jumpstart its space program by sending an astronaut, Hazza al-Mansouri, to the space station. And that has been Reading the Times for Saturday, March 7th, 2020.